In this series of videos, we're going to make something like this, a fishing net. And it's an interesting task because it brings in a number of tools that you might not think of using for something like this. Specifically, we're going to use nCloth to make the shape of the net, and then we're going to use renderable curves to make the net itself. We'll look at one other method for making it look like a net that could work in an animation, but this higher quality curve method can't really be animated, so we can consider this as a way to make a still image. We'll also look at using mesh and some dynamics to fill your net with something like fish. So let's take a look in the scene at what we have here. So you can see that this is just a collection of curves, and then inside is a mesh node with a whole bunch of fish in it. And then this very simple scene with the seabed. And you saw in the render that we had some lighting effects as well. And if there's time, we'll get to that. But I want to focus first on making the net. So let's create a new scene. So the first thing we need is the seabed. We'll just create that very quickly. We want this to be a little bit bumpy, so we will go into the creation node and turn up the subdivisions in length and width, or height and width, and then go to our sculpting tools, create our foamy brush, hold down Control just to reverse the direction of this. Depending on if you're on a PC or a Mac, hold down Shift just to smooth this out. So the reason I'm doing this is because we want to use dynamics to drag our fishing net along the ground here. And this way it will conform to the shape of the ground. So it's easier to see if we actually have a slightly bumpy ground. Okay, that's good. And now our approach to making the fishing net will be simple. We're just going to start with a polar sphere, polygon sphere, that comes together at the poles, and we're going to use each of these edge loops to make curves that will be the ropes of the mesh. So you want to set the number that you want ultimately here at the beginning. So subdivisions around the axis, I'm just going to increase it, let's say 32. Okay, that's pretty good. And I'm going to scale this up a little bit, maybe a little bit more, and then I'll just delete the history, freeze its transformations, and give it a name. Okay, great. So the way that we turn this into a deforming object is to turn it into an nCloth. I'm just moving it a little bit closer to the ground. I'm going to scale it up just a little bit more and move it up. And again, I'll just delete its history, freeze its transformations. But we're going to turn this into an nCloth and allow it to deform on the ground. So to do that, it's simple. We go to our FX menu set, nCloth, create nCloth. That's all we need to do. And then we'll select the ground and go to nCloth, create passive collider. A passive collider can collide, but it won't deform itself. And to make sure this plays back properly, right-click in your timeline, go to playback speed, and make sure you're on one of the play every frame settings. Right, so it falls down and deforms. There's one thing you'll notice here. It's a little bit of an issue. I tend to never use polar spheres for anything because of stuff like this. Things always go wrong at the poles, but in this case it kind of works well for a net. Anyway, it looks like there's some tension there. But just be aware that you could get some weird deformation at the poles. So now if we select this and open the attribute editor, in the nCloth setting, we can choose one of the presets here. And it's just on the edge of your screen, but I could choose something like loose thick knit. So it's like a cable knit sweater. Let me just move this over. And I'll just choose replace. And now it will just deform a little bit differently. Move this back over here. And all the things that change are mainly in this dynamic property setting. You can see there's a million things here. So it can compress quite easily, but it doesn't stretch as easily. Has very little bend resistance and so on. It's got a high restitution angle, which means it won't stick in a shape if you deform it past a certain point. So now if I play the animation, it will look a little bit different, but it's close enough, and we can tweak these settings later on. But the next thing we want to do is to make sure that it is held up at the top here. And to do that, we'll use a transform constraint. So let's right click and go to vertex, select this top row of vertices, just making sure that's all I have, and go to nConstraint and choose transform constraint. And all that means is, well, you'll see in a second, if I play the animation, it stays locked at the top there. And we can move this around to drag the bag behind it. But it's not quite acting the way that I want. And so there's one other thing I want to change. It's not in the nCloth node, but instead it's in the Nucleus node. So the Nucleus node are the environmental settings associated with this nCloth and any other nCloth you put in the scene. It's not really environmental settings. This is actually called the dynamic solver, but it calculates things like the gravity in the scene, the wind speed, the air density, and so on. But it also looks at the overall scale of your scene. So I think this is acting like an object that is either too little or too small. So if we go in the Nucleus node down to the bottom here, scale attributes, we can change the space scale to either 10 or 0.1. I never know what direction to go in. I just play with it until it looks good. So 0.1, so 1/10 the amount. There, so I think that's acting more the way I like it. It's acting like a bigger, heavier object. I'm actually just going to move my plane over because I'm going to drag this along the ground, and it's easier if I just keep it at the starting point. Okay, so next thing we want to do is grab our transform constraint and go to the channel box and set a key for me on translate Z at the beginning of our time. And then scrub over to, let's say, 48 and move this over and set a key on translate Z again. Now it doesn't show up at first because actually it's to play back to calculate how it changes over time. But if we play the animation now, we get something like that. So a couple of things that are happening here. This is meant to be full of fish. So we want something inside of it to simulate that. So we could actually fill this with particles or something to simulate fish in here. But I think an easier method is just to make a big solid object that will keep it sort of open. So I'll create another sphere. I'm going to just stick it, kind of tuck it inside. And I'll turn this into an nCloth too. Create nCloth. Open the attribute editor, and the preset I'll choose for this one is maybe, I think you can just read this, solid rubber. Choose replace. Now if we play the animation, it's got to drag that thing along with it. So it acts more like we'd like it to act, and it keeps it sort of bulked up on the inside. So that's looking pretty good. Just going to back up a little bit. Now, to me, it's sliding a little too easily, so how could we fix that? We could fix that in a couple of ways. We could choose that internal sphere that we just made, and we could, I don't know, give it some more mass. So this is in the nCloth node for that inside sphere, and it'll just be harder to pull along. If you do too much, yeah, you can see how it's deforming weirdly at the bottom. It's not calculating properly, so, or it's probably calculating properly, we're just asking it to do too much. So I'm going to put that back down to 2. And what I'll do instead is select the ground plane and change its friction amount to 1. So remember we turned the plane into a passive collider, so it has its own collision attributes here in the nRigid shape. So now that'll just make it a sort of a little stickier on the bottom. And then all you want to do is stop the animation at a point where you like the shape that it's making. So this looks pretty good, like a a deep sea fishing net that's being dragged along the bottom, probably destroying local flora and fauna. But there we go. We've got the shape that we want, but it's still in nCloth, and every time I go back to the beginning, it will resume its original shape. So what we want to do now is make a copy of this that's not in nCloth. And it's simple. You just select it and go to Edit, Duplicate. And now we have a new version of this thing, and it's not dynamic. So if I play back the animation, that duplicate just stays the way it was. I want to put it back in its original spot because that's where it's deforming properly on the ground. I'm going to delete that for now because there's one thing I forgot to look at. So this is all deforming nicely. So if I keep playing it. So let's say we're happy with something like this. If I hit 3 on the keyboard, it's easier to see, but 3 on the keyboard, it's easier to see. If we get in underneath here, you can see it's not actually touching the ground. There's a big gap between them, which could be fine. But if you want to minimize that gap, you have to change the collision thickness on both the bag and the ground. So we'll select the bag first and open up the attribute editor. Go up to the top to collisions in the nCloth shape, and the thickness is 0.059. That's pretty low. We can make it lower. Now, if we make it too low, it may not simulate properly. So you just have to be careful and just experiment. It could mean that they penetrate between each other and you get some collision problems. In the ground, the thickness is 0.077. Let's change that to 0.001 and replay the animation. Just make sure nothing bad happens. Okay, stop it where we like the look of it. And you can see it's much closer to the ground now, so that worked well. So there we've got the bag, and remember we just go to Edit, Duplicate, Edit, Duplicate, and we have a copy of the bag. So we're going to end this video in a minute and come back and look at the next step. But there's one thing I'm going to do first, and it'll be clear why later on. But just to give you a heads up, if I back this up, so here's our duplicate bag. Because this was made from an nCloth and duplicated, it's no longer an nCloth. However, it has inherited a weird property of the nCloth. You'll notice that I have the net1 transform node, then net1 shape node, and then output cloth 1. So there are 2 shape nodes that are associated with this object. And we actually want to get rid of the middle one, net1 shape. That's because when you start with an nCloth, you start with a base mesh, and then it's subjected to forces, and then that causes it to deform into its output shape. So every nCloth has an input shape and an output cloth. And when you duplicate it to remove the dynamics, it actually still preserves both of those shapes. And if we select net shape 1, so this is not the output cloth, but the whatever yours is called, and we go to object display, you can see it's listed as an intermediate object. If I select it, you can see it's selecting something over here, but we can't see it. And if we look at this shape node under object display, it's listed as an intermediate object. And this, you find this a lot of the times in Maya, where it's treating an object like a reference for something else. You don't want to see it, you don't want to render it, but it's got to be there in the background. If we turn off intermediate shape, we can see that the base mesh is still represented there. And we don't need it, so we can just make sure, select this tab, press select down at the bottom, and hit delete. And now we're just left with the transform node and the output cloth node. The pivot point is in a bad spot, so we'll center it. And the last thing that we're going to do is we're going to export this as an OBJ and bring it back in. Why? Because we want to use this as a collision object for the fish that we're going to put inside it later. And for some reason, this mesh won't work. there's something about it that MASH doesn't like, or at least the bullet solver doesn't like. So a quick solution is just to go to File, Export Selection, OBJ Export, make sure this is all turned off, Export, we'll call this Net Demo 2, and then we can just delete this, and then we can import the net demo 2 OBJ. It comes right back in. Its pivot point, it's probably in the wrong spot, so we can just center that again. And now it's a nice clean model with no history, no connection to that nCloth in any way, and we can use it for the next steps. So in the next steps, we'll come back and make that mesh.